So I've traced a little bit of my own itinerary, up to taking over direction of the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry at McGill, and I'll say more about where that went. But let me go back for a moment just to uh, highlight the way in which the environment created both by the group at McGill and in particular Henry Murphy, who really was reaching out to other scholars in Quebec, and the program at UDM in anthropology and psychological anthropology, and how Jérôme, that I mentioned, really created this bilingual, we could say bicultural, I suppose, environment, and in particular is a kind of crossroads of different strands and different streams in contemporary or recent medical and psychological anthropology. So there is a strong French tradition of ethnopsychiatry, ethnopsychoanalysis, eventually ethnopsychiatry, influenced largely by Georges Devereux originally, who came, from France came from, Romania, I think, or Hungary, forgetting, anyway, from probably Romania to France, and then went to the United States for a while, worked at in New York, and then at the Menninger Foundation, and then went back, and he influenced several key figures in the development of sort of culture and mental health, in particular Toby Nathan, who developed a clinical approach that took Devereux's rethinking of sort of psychoanalytic theory and the symbolic and applied it to ways of working with, particularly with migrant patients, so people coming from the Maghreb and other places to France. And Jérôme, because of the francophone nature of many of the key players and the interest in sort of new developments in the field, had strong links then to that environment. And so Toby Nathan came several times to speak and at conferences at Jérôme, and later Marie-Rose Moreau, and who was kind of yet another iteration of development of these approaches, partly inspired by Devereux, but adopting different strategies really for engaging with patients. So those Jérôme meetings, which gave a place for engagements with French ethnopsychoanalysis, ethnopsychiatry, medical anthropology, often also included people who are coming from other directions. So I mentioned Alan Rowland, a psychoanalyst who ended up doing supervision in India and in Japan, and wrote a book called In Search of Self in India and Japan, reflecting on to what extent did psychoanalytic theory need to be revised to apply to people really growing up in different environments and living in different environments. Or Sudha Kakar, again a psychoanalyst, teaching in Chicago and also working in India. These people participated in these conferences along with people who are influenced more by sort of North American medical anthropology, psychological anthropology, that I would say was becoming increasingly more cognitive and less wedded to psychoanalytic theory than tended to be the case in France. For a number of reasons, including the fact that in North America, psychoanalytic theory became, relatively stripped down kind of theory compared to the sort of further development of more complex theory in Europe and in France in particular. But for whatever reasons, we ended up having different traditions, and Montreal played a very important role as a crossroads where you could be exposed to many of these things, where people could have discussions. I'll come to it later, but we started a summer program and we would teach cultural psychiatry, and typically on the last day of our course, we would have a group discussion, myself, Alain Corin, Jules Bibot, Cécile Rousseau, all with very different perspectives, sometimes representing a more can say again, French ethno-psychoanalytic perspective, a more North American cognitive social perspective, whatever. And what students found very exciting was that there was this attitude of respect among the different people, just like the linguistic respect, kind of a sort of conceptual respect and curiosity and, disagreement, but then the disagreement, and sometimes very vigorous disagreement, but it was creative, it was respectful. So this, I think, for students was really exciting because it's rare that you see that. And particularly people coming from Europe for training who are used to a very hierarchical kind of academic context in which, the professor emanates wisdom and has the last word, and this was much more of a North American free-for-all, where you could really have this exchange. So it was an interesting container for intersection of very different traditions. And I think there's something special about Montreal as a space where that kind of thing can happen. And many of us benefited from it in a lot of ways, and certainly the students who came benefited from it. So that actually maybe speaks to the sort of the gradual transformation of our network and eventually the waning of Jérôme. When I took over the division, I also took over editing the journal. It became not so feasible for me to continue editing Santé, Culture, Health. It was just too much. We started, soon after I took over, we started a summer school because we felt that, we're doing we're studying topics that involve international environments and perspectives. We can't just do it in this, local parochial way, but it's hard. You want to come to study at McGill. There are many obstacles to doing that. Can we make it easy by having a course people can just come to for a limited period of time and so on? So we started that in 1991, where we had 92 we had a hiatus. This year is the 28th annual summer school. We had a hiatus because of COVID. So it's been a great success. Over 1,000 people have come to train here. They're part of an international network of people interested in these topics. It's very ecumenical in the sense that there are many perspectives out there. And I don't think we've tried to found a school unless you say, well, that kind of open, pluralistic, bricolage of different theories is the McGill approach, kind of, rather than here's the canonical version of how we approach things. I think there is a central element that we've emphasized compared to other areas in culture and mental health, which is the importance of social science, not only as a way of engaging more deeply with different life worlds, but as a way of critiquing the taken for granted. This is when Alan Young is asked for his sort of, short definition of culture. He says culture is the taken for granted. So that's a good way to begin discussions with people, because it says, okay, so we all have culture, and it's exactly the thing that we're not looking at. So how are we going to become aware of it? And that's a very good way to talk to practitioners, and all kinds of people begin to get intrigued by this. I think once you're at a certain level of knowing what you're doing, you begin to want to know why are you doing it and what's it embedded in. So that's been extremely helpful. But because of developing that arena of activity, we drew in all the Jérôme partners, and they were all participating. And Jérôme itself, I think, at some point became something that didn't have the, there wasn't the time and energy for people to have yet another set of meetings. We did have joint seminars. We set up a variety. We had a culture and clinic seminar that for many years Cécile Rousseau held at the Children's Hospital. And people from UDM, from UQAM, from other institutions would come and present and participate. So I think what came out of Jérôme for all of us was very much an inter-university network and an attitude that the universities are very interested in their own resources and their boundaries and their reputation. But for us as scholars, we're interested in people who are interested in the same topics and who have something interesting to say. And where they happen to get their paycheck or where their classroom is not so important. And I think we've been very fortunate to be able to function that way. Much more when I visit other places and I see how in the US or other places how universities function, it's quite unusual. The degree of fluidity we've had for faculty and for students has been very common for 30, 40 years for us to have students, this person's getting their PhD there, but you'll be their main supervisor. So there have been students at UDM where there was a supervisor on paper, and I was the de facto main supervisor, and vice versa. So I think it's been an exceptionally rich environment, and I would credit Jérôme and the people who created Jérôme and the attitudes they had as I say, ironically, at a time when linguistic tensions were at some of their most difficult, or at least went through that period in the early 70s and so on. And yet, Jerome sort of persevered through that and exemplified a mode of engagement. And so we are now, where I can look around and see students at faculty at UDM, at UQAM and so on, who are former students from McGill and who continue to collaborate and so on. So the network has reproduced itself and extended itself over the years, I think, in very, very constructive ways. And so I would say, by way of, there are probably other things to say about my own itinerary, but what I would say is that, to sum up this story, I had a series of very fortunate accidents of encountering key figures in a kind of renaissance or renewal of medical anthropology and psychological anthropology, who became mentors and friends. So I was able to learn informally, who created opportunities for me. That to be included and to be part of the discussion and to contribute. And this has led in many winding ways. I remember I think 1989, there was the International Congress of Anthropology and Ethnographic Sciences or whatever, something, this big international organization. And they had their meeting in Zagreb. And so Gilles Bibot and Ellen Corin organized sessions on the violence of interpretation, which became an edited book that they put out. And so I got invited to contribute to that. The other contributors were, and I can't remember all the names, but I remember Vincent Crapanzano in particular. I mean, many very eminent and very remarkable people. So being able to be included in that was amazing. That was a time when I began a whole series of papers on metaphor that have continued to be a preoccupation up to the present. And I remember flying back from that meeting, sitting next to Tanya Lerman, who had just finished her PhD and was getting ready for her next piece of work. And we had a multi-hour flight of just chatting with each other, and that became a friendship and collegiality that continues up to the present. I have right now we have a new faculty member at the Jewish General Hospital, researcher Michael Lifshitz, who's trained as a neuroscientist, who studies hypnosis and meditation and other things, and who went to do a 2-year postdoc with Tanya to learn ethnography and experience near phenomenological anthropology and so on. So he's now able to bring together brain imaging and really rich understanding of people's life worlds and experience. And he's now studying religious experience and with Tanya, but also psychedelics and other kinds of things. So it's a whole. You can see the long arc in a way of how the seeds that were planted and the conversations that occurred in the 70s and 80s, 80s and 90s have turned into a generation now, a young generation of scholars who are more interdisciplinary. And I think that's one of the really interesting issues here, that for me, as somebody who has come at this from a zigzag kind of path, the engagement with anthropology is really about a set of tools and perspectives and values that can be brought to bear to ask questions about things that are important to me. So I should say that discipline of anthropology is not my primary commitment. My primary commitment is to, I guess, understanding human experience. And anthropology is one large collection of traditions and approaches that has a lot to say about that, and that I think says it in unique ways that other things cannot. Other traditions, other social sciences even cannot replace. But as opposed to what happens in academia, which is that disciplines become guilds and become very concerned with policing their boundaries, because one of their first function is to reproduce themselves. When you operate in a health environment, what legitimates your activity is the health problem that you're addressing, not the discipline that you're reproducing. I mean, I suppose it could be true to me to some extent as a psychiatrist that I have anxieties about whether psychiatry persists and survive. Years ago, Arthur Kleinman said he thought psychiatry would die, that it would just be absorbed, on the one hand, into neurology and neuroscience, which we see some of that going on, and on the other hand, I guess, into social work or psychology, which would do better job of providing the psychological and social interventions, and there would be no need for the sort of practitioner who tries to have elements of all those in what they're doing. That hasn't quite happened, although I think those tensions are more fierce than ever right now at this moment. But anyway, just to say that for me, I sort of have not had to contend with that very directly, and instead, by saying I'm interested in mental health and illness and varieties of human experience, and anthropology offers a powerful set of tools for looking at that and ways of looking at that decenter and that let us get beyond our assumptions. That's enough. That's enough to motivate an intense engagement with that and a desire to see more of that happening. What's interesting for me is that it is true that it's in anthropological settings, particularly in medical and psychological anthropology, that I have felt the most at home, much more so than I do typically in psychiatric settings. And so that was my experience the first time I went to a meeting of the Society for Psychological Anthropology, which seemed to have huge breadth. At that time, this is quite a few years ago, they had a group that were Lacanian and a group that were developmental psychology and a group that were cognitivists, and they had all these different groups, and it was a bit like a circus with many rings. They weren't necessarily talking to each other very much, but the tent was big enough to include all of them. So I found that very comforting and enjoyable. And I remember connecting to Doug Holland at that time, who was a psychological anthropologist who was eventually the chair of anthropology at UCLA, and who retrained, like Alan Coran, retrained as a psychoanalyst. Does both. And I remember making these connections. So it's interesting for me that here I am now many years on, and I am currently the president of the Society for Psychological Anthropology, the American Anthropological Association. And I was invited to do that despite not having a PhD in anthropology, on the basis of the work that I've done and all these connections, so that people know kind of what I'm interested in, what I do, and how it fits with what they're doing. And so we are partners by virtue of our interest and activity rather than the badge that we're wearing or the credential that we have. So that's very interesting to me, and that does again speak to interdisciplinarity, which I think we're training people to be interdisciplinary, and then unfortunately they then face an environment that is still very disciplinary in terms of finding a job and so on. It's often the case. Not so much in the health sphere. In the health sphere, they can say, fine, I'm interested in such and such a health problem, and I'm trained as an anthropologist, or I'm trained as a sociologist, whatever. Okay, bring your tools, bring your skills, and you can work here on this. But if you say I want to go teach anthropology, you're not, you haven't got the full credentials, the full background, or whatever to do it. So I just mentioned that because, as I say, it's a dilemma for some of our students, because the work that we do at the intersection of culture and mental health is fascinating to a lot of people. A lot of people would like more scope for doing that, and they're often frustrated, whether it's in their professional training, their training as a psychologist or a social worker or a psychiatrist, and they're saying we get so little about the social world and about diversity, or for that matter, they're in anthropology and they're not getting enough of engagement with the exigencies of the social world, which I think is interesting because anthropologists are rewarded for producing rich ethnographies, thick description, highly nuanced accounts of human experience. Clinicians, practitioners are rewarded for figuring out how to do something helpful with the smallest amount of resources and the least amount of time. So they're very different ways of thinking, very different constraints, each of which has its own virtues, I guess. Figuring out how to bridge those, or what kind of useful dialogue can there be, or are these really just such different activities they have not much to say to each other? That's been one of my interests and concerns personally. So I think that's sort of maybe enough biography for the moment. I mean, there are other elements that will come out in talking about different lines of work, but I think I sort of almost brought it up to the present.